Okay, so now we're going to continue with our tour going through the central nervous system, specifically the brain. And we started out with the cerebrum, and we're working our way towards the core of the brain, then we'll work our way down into the brainstem before we finally wrap up with the spinal cord. So when we were talking about these cerebral hemispheres, we talked about different functional areas as well as different structural areas like the different lobes. And now we're starting to get into some areas like we'll talk about more of the limbic system as well as the basal ganglia and some of the different aspects of the brain that kind of span some of the different regions that we were talking about earlier. So when we're looking at a lot of the functional area of the brain, especially the cerebrum, we're talking about the cerebral cortex, right? That's where we have our interneurons, where we're processing this information. But it's really important that we get information to all these different regions of the cerebrum, as well as allow the two hemispheres of the cerebrum to communicate. So we talked about lateralization, where they have different specialized functions often, but we've got to be able to communicate between different lobes, between different hemispheres, etc. So that's when we get into the cerebral white matter as well. So these are going to be myelinated fibers that are going into different areas of a lobe, going to different areas of a hemisphere, and even going across hemispheres as well. So basically three different types of white matter, cerebral white matter: association, commissural, and projection fibers. And so the association fibers are going to be connecting different parts of the same hemisphere, right? Associating what's going on, like the visual with the auditory, etc. Commissural are going to be connecting the gray matter in the two hemispheres, right? And then projection fibers are going to be going between the different brain areas that are higher brain areas with lower brain areas, or even the spinal cord itself. So we can see some of them in the diagram here, right? So you can see the projections that are going up. We can see the commissural that are going across, like in the corpus callosum, and then we can see the association fibers that are going within a hemisphere. Okay, so as we get down to the basal nuclei as well, getting into these kind of functional areas that straddle the line between particular regions of the brain, the basal nuclei, or the basal ganglia, usually the basal nuclei, are going to be refining some of the actions that maybe we saw up in the cortex, like in the primary motor cortex, etc. So they're going to influence muscle movements. They're going to also play a little bit of a role in cognition as well as emotion. They also are going to make sure that the intended actions that we talked about in the primary motor cortex as well as the premotor cortex are carried out effectively. And so there's kind of this fine-tuning of it, adjusting of it, etc. And so it makes sense that the basal nuclei are some of the areas of the brain that are most affected by Parkinson's and Huntington's disease, where you have different types of actions that you can't control, or you have a hard time. The thought process is, I want to move voluntarily, but the muscles just don't do what you are intending them to do. Okay, so we go from basal nuclei, again, kind of working our way in, like you saw from the graphic there, down to the core of the brain, which we call the diencephalon. Diencephalon has three different areas: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus, which is kind of like the roof of the diencephalon. So we can see it through here, right? So there's definitely the core of the brain. So thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. And when you look at it, it kind of looks like, kind of a bird, if you will. So if you kind of see it in its entirety there, we can see that there's a beak of the bird down here, right? You can see that there's an eye of the bird here. You may even call the corpus callosum here a big crest, like a peacock crest or a rooster crest or whatever. And then the head of the bird as well. So the head of the bird with the eye in the center is going to be the thalamus. Hypothalamus is going to be inferior to it, hence the name. And then epithalamus, as we mentioned, kind of forms the roof along here instead. All right, So the thalamus is most of the diencephalon, and there's two hemispheres to it. Much like there's two cerebral hemispheres, there's two thalamic hemispheres, and it's in between them where we find the third ventricle. So there's a small bit like this that connects the two hemispheres, and that space through there is where the third ventricle exists. So this part that connects them is called the intermediate mass, sometimes also called the interthalamic adhesion, holding those two thalamic, if you will, hemispheres together. Okay, so what's the role of this thalamus? Well, when we look here, we can see it's right at the core of the brain, like we said. So it's a major pathway as we see sensory information coming up, as well as motor information coming down. It's going to need to pass through that area. So in terms of functions, it acts as a relay station or a router, right? So like the router in your house that's relaying, if you will, sending out the signal, the Wi-Fi signal to your different electronic devices, right? It's sending it where it needs to go. That's a bit like what the thalamus is doing as well. It also kind of mediates that too, right? So much like your router can be like a signal booster or something like that, or selective in terms of where it sends the signal or when it sends the signal, the thalamus can do that as well, mediating sensation as well as motor activities, and even acting to as part of what we call the reticular formation that ends up kind of waking up the cerebrum as well. Okay, so then we get to the hypothalamus, which hypothalamus is even smaller than the thalamus, but don't think that it's less important. So what we find is there's some different sections to it. For instance, there are what are called the mammillary bodies, which are important for relaying the olfactory, right? Because olfactory, like we saw, olfactory lobe, etc., and processing area is going to be kind of on par with the olfactory cavity, right, with the nasal cavity, etc. And then there's an infundibulum, and the infundibulum actually connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. So you can see this pea-sized gland down here, and the infundibulum is the stem, if you will. So there's a direct connection between those two. So the pituitary gland is also known as the master gland. It's kind of the head of the endocrine system or the hormone system of the body. And so while it's the head, there's always going to be somebody higher than you, and that's going to be the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, which controls, like a puppet master, lots of our other different types of endocrine glands. So it's really a connection between our nervous system and our endocrine system. It's also, the hypothalamus is an area where it controls a lot of different aspects of homeostasis. So it has a lot of control centers in it, right, where the sensory information comes in and we compare it with the set point, and then we can, if necessary, produce some sort of effect to adjust the body. And so it adjusts all kinds of different life-sustaining activities: blood pressure, heartbeat, digestive activities, pupil size, etc. It's also part of the limbic system, or the emotional brain, so there's a lot of primal, if you will, emotions associated with it. And if we look at some of those functions, like we said, body temperature, when we use that example of the thermostat in your house as an example of homeostasis and little adjustments, that type of thing, this is really where the thermostat is. It's in the hypothalamus, and it helps to regulate metabolism and energy, right? Regulating hunger, where we increase our input, or satiety, where we become satiated and decrease our input for both food and drink. And then also it helps to regulate the sleep-wake cycle. So lots of things that maintain the body. And we said it has a direct influence over the pituitary gland. We'll find that there are two halves to the pituitary gland. So it hormonally controls, it rains down chemicals on the anterior part, and in fact, the posterior part of the pituitary is just an extension of the hypothalamus. So you can't get much more of a direct connection than that. So, as you can imagine, with controlling so many of these different homeostatic reflexes, if the hypothalamus starts underperforming, or really not, or if you will, becoming disturbed, then there are a number of different disorders that can arise. Okay, so we had thalamus, we had epithalamus, the beak of the bird, hypothalamus, sorry, now we have epithalamus, like the roof. So at the posterior part of the epithalamus, we have the pineal gland, and the pineal gland has a job of secreting melatonin, which helps to regulate your activities. And so you get increases in melatonin at night, which makes you slow down and get sleepy, and then you have a decrease in melatonin during the day, which allows you to be awakened. And in fact, the pineal gland, how does it know that? How does it know when it's night and when it's day, right? So it's that third eye that you hear about. And in fact, there are some vertebrates that actually have photoreceptors in a thin part of the skull, like a number of reptiles. They'll have it in the thin part of the skull where they won't be able to form an image out of it, but they will get light sensation that will tell their pineal gland when it is day and they should be active, and when it is night and they should be less active, at least for diurnal animals. For us, it was only, it's been a while now, 15 years ago, but it seems like yesterday, when they discovered that our pineal gland was getting a visual cue, or basically a photo cue, light cue, but not from the photoreceptors in terms of our rods and cones, but they discovered other photopigments in the eye associated with these cells that are called ganglion cells that we'll learn about in our special senses section. So totally different set of cells in the eye that had a totally different photopigment, but it would be sensitive to light and dark, and it would relay that information back to the pineal gland. So interesting stuff. Okay, so thalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus. So now we're working our way down. We're going to get to the brainstem as well. So here we can see it uncolored. Again, we can see thalamus through here. There's our hypothalamus, right? Triangular, if you will, going through there. Epithalamus coming back here. And this is our pineal gland. So when you do your sheep brain dissection, if you look posteriorly from the brain and you separate the cerebellum from the cerebrum, you can get a little view into that pineal gland. All right, so we're going to work our way down here to the brainstem. So with the brainstem, 3 different parts: midbrain at the top, then the pons, the anterior bulge, then the medulla oblongata that almost looks like the spinal cord itself. Lots of different cranial nerves coming off of here. There are a number of cranial nerves. There's 12 pairs. There's a number that came off previous to this, but many, 10 of the 12 that are flowing into or out of the brainstem. So here we see an inferior view, and you can start to see a number of our different cranial nerves. So here's one, right? So these are the olfactory nerves through here, optic nerves that come in and then form this X, which is called the optic chiasma. You can see how it goes across. We talk about the crossing of signals going through the brain. Then you start to get to other ones, which are going to be, for instance, like the oculomotor nerve, as well as the other pairs. But you see all these little wires that are sticking off here? Those are cranial nerves. And there's our anterior bulge, if you will. That's the pons right there. And then through here is when we have the medulla oblongata. All right, so the midbrain, we said, is the top. It's between the diencephalon, the core of the brain, and the pons down below. It's these bulges, if you will, that have passageways for neurons that are headed up or going down. The cerebral aqueduct, which is that hallway between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle, is kind of passing through this way as well. We also have on the posterior side the corpora quadrigemina, right? Quad, four bumps that are on the posterior side. The superior ones are called the superior colliculi. These give us visual reflexes. And then the inferior one are auditory relay centers and reflexes. So for instance, if some loud noise occurs to the side there, you'll automatically turn your head, your eyes will rotate that way, that type of thing. There's also an area of the midbrain that's called the substantia nigra, and this is functionally hooked up to the basal nuclei, and in fact it is also affected when people have Parkinson's in terms of control. Okay, so top of the brain stem, midbrain, now we work down to that bulge, right, the pons. So in this area, the pons, again, relay, anything passing from the spinal cord has to go through the brain stem, but we also find that it helps in the reticular formation, again, helping to awaken our cerebrum, but it almost acts like a manager for the medulla that's right underneath it. A manager in overseeing and coordinating the breathing rate, kind of some of the more complex changes in your breathing can be overseen by the pons, and then the medulla oblongata down below it, it's kind of like the shift manager that actually sends those signals directly to things like the diaphragm as well as other organs that help to regulate breathing. So, as we were talking about, medulla oblongata down below, it's a main area where we tend to get, again, respiratory control. There's going to be some constriction and dilation of the tubes that are going down to the lungs, as well as that umbrella-shaped diaphragm, and cardiovascular control, increasing, decreasing heart rate, the strength of an individual contraction, even the constriction of the blood vessels, which affect blood pressure and blood flow. So that's directly from the medulla oblongata. So it is in control of a number of different life-sustaining reflexes in the body. Even when you talk about some of those reflexes like coughing, sneezing, vomiting, stuffy head fever so you can rest medicine, that type of thing, those types of reflexes that are, again, preserving life to a certain extent are handled down in the medulla oblongata. So the brain stem, if you lose higher brain function, right, personality, creativity, memory, and stuff like that, that's going to be housed up there. But the vital functions of the brain that control and orchestrate the body are down in that brain stem itself. Some of the things you'll see in the medulla oblongata, there are these pyramids, these kind of triangular shaped bumps that stick up from it. You saw it on that inferior view there. These are formed by tracts that are going from the motor cortex. And actually, as you go through that area, we get what's called decussation. So you get the crossing over of the fibers. Like we said, how the right side of the brain controls the left half of the body. That's where the crossing over is actually occurring. So it goes down into the brainstem, and that's where it cuts across one side to the other. So we see that down here. Here's our medulla, right down here. One thing I mentioned, we talked about that cerebral spinal fluid and the different ventricles. There's that fourth ventricle right here. The fourth ventricle is between the pons on the left and the cerebellum on the right. So that brings us to the cerebellum, that kind of walnut-shaped part of the brain. Remember, has the longer name, but the smaller part compared to the cerebrum. And this also does a lot of processing of voluntary motor output. So it helps to coordinate the skeletal muscles, etc. Also plays a major role in balance. And so, if, for instance, you've had a little too much alcohol, we know alcohol is one of those things that can get across the blood-brain barrier. And you can imagine balance is one of the things to go, that your cerebellum is going to become affected, as well as your movements, right? You get kind of dumb in terms of your movements. You kind of overshoot and you spill things, etc. You can imagine not only higher brain centers, but cerebellum significantly affected. So the cerebellum also has two hemispheres, just like the cerebrum. They're actually connected with this little, what somebody thought was a worm-like structure called the vermis. And when we look inside of them, we see a pattern of white matter in a bunch of gray matter. So in a way, it has a similar type of pattern of myelinated and unmyelinated cells like we see up in the cerebrum. But that makes sense, right? Because we're going to do processing along the edge, and when we're going in and out of it, that's when we want things to go very quickly. So, like we said, a lot of processing that's going on here, coordinating with the cerebral cortex itself in terms of voluntary muscle contractions, and then we said it's involved in balance. So it's going to get sensory information from proprioceptors, which give you an idea about how your body is positioned in space, even though you can't see it. And it's calculating and readjusting the different ways to produce the action that you intend. So they think that there may also be some effects in terms of higher brain function, thinking, language, and emotion, etc. But there's always new things that they're learning, to be sure. All right, so now what we've done is we've gone through our tour, cerebrum, diencephalon, and then getting down into the brainstem itself. The last section here goes through some functional brain systems, some areas that work together for particular functions, but they involve a lot of different areas of the brain rather than just being able to say, oh, that area handles that, and oh, that area handles that. So we'll finish up our last lecture, at least on the brain itself, with these functional brain systems, but we'll do that next.